It was early evening when I finished my grocery shopping at the neighborhood supermarket, the kind of routine errand that most people complete quickly and forget about almost immediately afterward. Yet for me, the trip had taken longer than expected because the store was unusually crowded and my workday had already been exhausting, which meant that by the time I pushed my cart out, through the sliding glass doors and into the parking lot with several heavy grocery bags balanced carefully inside it, I was feeling the familiar mixture of physical fatigue and mental overload that tends to follow a long day of work combined with navigating crowded public spaces. And so as I slowly walked across the parking lot toward my car, carefully steering the cart around, passing vehicles and other shoppers, I found myself already thinking about how good it would feel to simply sit down for a moment before driving home. The parking lot itself was busy in the slow, steady way that grocery store parking lots often are during the early evening hours, with families loading groceries into their trunks, people returning carts to mail corrals, and the occasional vehicle creeping cautiously through the rows of parked cars in search of an open space, while the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the overhead parking lot lights flickered on one by one as the sky gradually shifted from pale blue to the muted orange and gray tones that come just before dusk. When I finally reached my car, which was parked near the middle of the lot between a pickup truck and a compact SUV, I began the familiar routine of unloading groceries from the cart into the back seat and trunk, lifting each bag carefully to avoid tearing the plastic and making sure fragile items like eggs and bread were placed on top of heavier containers like milk jugs and canned goods, a process that took a few minutes because I prefer to organize things properly, rather than simply throwing everything into the car and dealing with the mess later. And by the time I finished the last bag, I could feel the tiredness in my shoulders and legs reminding me that I had been moving nonstop since early that morning. Instead of immediately starting the car and pulling out of the parking space, I decided to sit in the driver's seat for a few minutes with the engine off, simply to rest and let my mind settle before dealing with the evening traffic that would be waiting on the road outside the store. And so I closed the door, leaned back against the seat, and allowed myself a moment of quiet stillness while the faint scent of groceries filled the car, and the distant sounds of shopping carts rolling across the pavement drifted through the air. For the first minute or two, I simply sat there with my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, looking out through the windshield without really focusing on anything in particular, letting my thoughts wander from the long workday behind me to the small tasks that still waited at home, such as putting away groceries and making dinner. And it was during this quiet pause that I noticed a woman standing several parking spaces away beside a dark-colored sedan, her posture stiff and her gaze directed toward my car with a kind of suspicious intensity that immediately caught my attention, even though I could not imagine why my presence inside my own parked vehicle would attract such scrutiny. At first, I assumed she was simply glancing around the lot while waiting for someone, or trying to remember where she had parked. Yet the longer I remained seated, the more obvious it became that she was watching me specifically, because every time I shifted slightly in my seat or glanced in her direction, I would find her eyes fixed on my car again. And although the situation felt slightly uncomfortable, it still seemed harmless enough that I decided to ignore it and continue resting for a moment before leaving. However, the atmosphere shifted noticeably when she suddenly reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and began dialing while continuing to stare toward my vehicle with an expression that looked less like curiosity and more like irritation mixed with suspicion. And although I could not hear what she was saying from inside my car, the animated movements of her free hand and the sharp tone of her voice suggested that she was describing something she believed to be serious, which puzzled me because I had done nothing more than sit quietly in a parked car after finishing my grocery shopping. The situation grew even stranger when I noticed her pointing directly at my vehicle several times while speaking into the phone, pacing slowly beside her own car as though she were narrating the scene in real time to whoever was on the other end of the call. And it was only when I saw her gesture again in my direction that the uncomfortable possibility crossed my mind that she might actually be reporting me for something, even though I could not imagine what that something could possibly be. A few minutes later, the distant sound of a police siren floated across the parking lot, and although emergency vehicles occasionally passed by on the nearby road, the sound grew steadily louder until a patrol car turned into the lot and began driving slowly down the row of parked vehicles, its blue lights flashing in bright pulses that reflected off windshields and metal shopping carts while several nearby shoppers paused to watch the unexpected arrival. The woman immediately stepped forward and waved energetically at the approaching patrol car, clearly signaling that she was the one who had placed the call. And when the vehicle stopped a short distance from where I was parked, two uniformed officers stepped out and began walking toward us with the calm, attentive expressions of people who were prepared to assess whatever situation had been reported. As they approached, the woman began speaking rapidly and gesturing toward my car with dramatic urgency. And although I could not hear every word from where I sat, I could make out phrases like suspicious, just sitting there watching everyone, and hasn't moved for a long time, which made it clear that the entire incident had somehow been triggered by the simple fact that I had remained seated in my car instead of driving away immediately after loading my groceries. One of the officers walked up to the driver's side window and knocked lightly on the glass. And when I lowered the window, he greeted me politely and asked if everything was all right. His tone neutral and professional rather than accusatory, which reassured me that he was simply gathering information rather than assuming wrongdoing. I explained calmly that I had just finished grocery shopping and had decided to sit for a few minutes before driving home because I was tired after a long day of work, gesturing toward the bags of groceries stacked neatly in the back seat as evidence of what I had been doing moments earlier, and the officer glanced inside the car briefly before nodding, as though the explanation matched exactly what he expected to find. Meanwhile, the second officer listened patiently as the woman continued explaining her concerns, insisting that it was unusual and suspicious for someone to remain inside a parked car without leaving right away, and claiming that my presence had made her feel uncomfortable because I appeared to be watching people in the parking lot, even though in reality I had been doing little more than resting and occasionally looking out the windshield while collecting my thoughts. After a short moment of quiet conversation between the two officers, the one standing beside my window turned toward the woman and spoke with calm firmness, explaining that sitting in a parked car in a public parking lot is not illegal or inherently suspicious behavior, especially when the person has just finished shopping and is clearly preparing to leave. And although he delivered this explanation politely, it was obvious from his tone that the situation did not require police intervention. The woman seemed dissatisfied with this response and attempted to argue that people should not be allowed to sit in cars and watch others in parking lots because it could make shoppers feel unsafe. Yet the officer patiently repeated that no laws had been broken and that individuals are free to remain in their vehicles as long as they are not causing disturbances or engaging in illegal activity, which in this case clearly was not happening. Several nearby shoppers who had paused to watch the flashing lights and the small crowd gathered around the patrol car gradually resumed loading their groceries and returning carts, some glancing over with expressions of mild disbelief as they realized the police had been called over something as ordinary as a man resting in his car after shopping. After confirming that everything was fine, the officers wished me a good evening and walked back toward their patrol car, their departure marked by the gradual fading of the flashing blue lights as they drove out of the parking lot and disappeared onto the main road, leaving behind the quiet hum of normal activity that had been interrupted by the brief misunderstanding. The woman lingered beside her car for a moment with an expression that looked more frustrated than satisfied before finally getting into the driver's seat and backing out of her parking space without making eye contact with me, as though the outcome of the situation had not matched the dramatic urgency with which she had reported it. I remained seated for another minute or two, partly because I still needed the rest and partly because the sheer absurdity of what had just happened required a moment to process. As I finally started the engine and carefully backed out of my own parking space, I could not help reflecting on how a simple act like sitting quietly in a parked car had somehow been interpreted as suspicious enough to bring the police to a grocery store parking lot. As I drove toward the exit with the grocery bags rustling softly behind me and the evening sky fading into darkness above the rows of parked cars, the tension of the encounter slowly gave way to a strange kind of amusement because although the situation had been mildly frustrating in the moment, it also served as a reminder of how easily ordinary actions can be misunderstood when viewed through the lens of someone else's assumptions. By the time I reached the road and merged into the steady flow of evening traffic, the entire incident already felt like one of those odd everyday stories that seem almost unbelievable when read later, yet it had happened simply because one person had decided that a man sitting quietly in his car after grocery shopping must somehow be doing something suspicious, which in its own strange way said far more about the unpredictability of human perception than it did about the perfectly ordinary act of taking a few minutes to rest before driving home.